Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, the Senator from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask you to ask consent to speak as in morning business for 15 minutes.
The Senator, without objection, the Senator is recognized for 15 minutes.
Mr. President, I rise today to express my strong concerns about the direction that Republicans and the Tea Party want to take our country, beginning with an irresponsible government shutdown simply for the sake of pursuing a social agenda, and continuing their reckless budget plan that will devastate seniors and those most vulnerable over the next decade while rewarding millionaires with even more tax breaks. I looked at this Republican budget put out by Chairman Ryan, and it's a proposal that takes $1.5 trillion out of health care for seniors and children and gives it to the wealthiest. But it does not even limit subsidies for special corporate interests like big oil. And in so doing, it fundamentally resets our values and turns back the clock on the progress we've made to protect our parents and grandparents, seniors and children in this country, and keep the playing field reasonably level. But even before that discussion, I want to make a few things clear about the implications of shutting the government down and what we on this side have already cut from the President's budget to reach an agreement. We started this year off with $41 billion less in spending than the President requested. Plus, in March, we cut another $10 billion below last year's funding levels, including the complete elimination of 33 federal programs. In total, we have offered up $33 billion in cuts for the remainder of the current funding year, which ends in September. But the most radical elements of the Republican Party won't take yes for an answer. They say we have not come far enough, which in Tea Party terms means we haven't given them everything they want. So they'll shut the government down rather than take yes for an answer. I saw a picture, front page of one of the papers, and it said, with a Tea Party banner, it said, "Shut her down, shut her down." Well, I thought we were here to make sure we kept the government going. It's clear their real reason for shutting down the government at this point is to promote a social agenda that is not acceptable to the broader part of the country. They're willing to shut down the federal government, put our economy, our small businesses, our veterans at risk, and potentially delay tax refunds for millions of American families, all simply to make a political point and to try to impose a social agenda of a minority on the majority. Shutting down the federal government over a woman's right to choose, or the federal government's ability to enforce laws that protect our children's health, in my view, takes irresponsibility to a whole new level. Even the Speaker of the House himself has said a shutdown will, quote, end up costing more than we save. And the Speaker's right. It would cost about $8 billion every week, or 2.2% of GDP every week the government is shut down. Now, the Speaker's right on the substance, but he has not yet been willing to lead and deal with the tempest in the Tea Party on his right, threatening to cut our economic recovery short to satisfy a narrow right-wing political agenda. At a time when small businesses are just beginning to get access to capital they need to create jobs for American families, a shutdown will result in $400 million in capital each week not going to small businesses through the SBA loan program, and will throw the engine of small business job growth into neutral when we want it to be in overdrive. In the last shutdown, more than $1 million in small business loans to 5,200 businesses were delayed. So we know what small businesses are in for if we have another shutdown. Mr. President, this is not the time in our recovery efforts to say no to helping small businesses put people to work. In housing, the FHA loan process, which accounts for 30% of the housing market, will be interrupted just as we enter the height of the spring season home buying in my state of New Jersey. With prices low and so many houses on the market, this is not the time to prevent 15,000 homeowners from getting a home loan every week, more than half of which are for new home purchases that would reduce the inventory of the surplus properties. Now, unfortunately, because Social Security is a mandatory fortunately, I should say, because Social Security is a mandatory funding program, seniors and the disabled will continue to receive their checks. But if we let the Tempest and the Tea Party shut down the government, interruptions at the Social Security Administration could delay changes in people's benefits and payments. In just 4 days of the last shutdown, 112,000 new claims for Social Security retirement and disability benefits were not taken. Over 800,000 callers were unable to reach the Social Security Administration, and certainly in this economy, this is not a time to leave those who rely on Social Security with nothing. And with the tax season upon us, it's certainly not the right time to delay tax refunds that families are anxiously awaiting in order to make ends meet and put into the economy and help the recovery keep going. It's not the time to shut down 368 National Park Service sites, the Smithsonian, the Statue of Liberty, the monuments, museums, national parks across the country, which in the last shutdown lost 9 million visitors, and the tourism revenues to those communities. And given that our last shutdown occurred in the dead of winter, we can expect a shutdown in the midst of spring breaks and high tourist season to have a much larger impact on tourism revenues and family wallets who have already booked trips to national parks and planned visits to national monuments and museums. And to put it in context, if we shut down the government for 5 weeks, we could lose up to $1.2 billion based on the $12 billion worth of visitors brought to the national park communities last year. And if the Tea Party continues to insist on a government shutdown, military paychecks would be delayed at a time when military families are struggling with multiple deployments and struggling like everyone else to make ends meet. They'll ultimately get paid, but only when the shutdown is finished. In the last shutdown, more than 400,000 veterans saw their disability checks delayed. Now, let's not repeat that mistake when more of our wounded sons and daughters are returning home from 2 wars raging abroad every day. And if the Tea Party continues to insist on a government shutdown, clinical trials of life-saving drugs will be halted, new patients will not be accepted into clinical research programs at the National Institutes of Health. If the Tea Party continues to insist on a government shutdown, they'll put our entire economy at risk. As a matter of fact, business leaders have said that a shutdown could result in higher interest rates and chaos in the markets. Every week, 350 import licenses could be delayed, resulting in holding up billions of dollars in American exports at a time when we need those exports to help fuel the recovery. During the 1995 shutdown, $2.2 billion in U.S. exports couldn't leave the country because 1,000 export licenses could not be issued. Ivan Seidenberg, the chairman and CEO of Verizon, who is also the chairman of the Business Roundtable, said, and I quote, "I don't think any of the CEOs would welcome a government shutdown. Problems for business would run from contracts being postponed to disruptions in the supply chain." John Engler, the president of the Business Roundtable, said, quote, "Business would face the danger of the law of unintended consequences. Interest rates could rise, and there could be turmoil in the financial markets. Now, this would all happen because Republicans, being held hostage by Tea Partiers, have rejected $33 billion in spending cuts for this year because they did not get all that they wanted, because they aren't getting their way on unrelated, extraneous social issues like women's reproductive rights and enforcing laws on our books to protect our children's health. They simply will not take yes for an answer, because yes on spending cuts isn't really their only goal. Spending cuts is not why they are trying to shut the government down. I would remind our colleagues that democratic governments are not about total victory. Authoritarian governments do that, not democracies. In democracies, we are all fairly elected to represent our constituents. We all have a view. We all have a vote. We all have an obligation to govern and legislate for every American, not just for those who hold the views of the Tea Party. With all due respect, Mr. President, Tea Partiers claim to love our right to free speech and yet clearly don't believe anyone's views other than their own are acceptable. I would say to our colleagues, we all have deeply held beliefs. Defending them and shouting them from the rooftops is easy, but listening to those who disagree with us and working on the differences is the hard work of government. I would remind my colleagues on the other side that the word Congress is derived from a Latin verb meaning to walk together. We have already made cuts to the President's budget. We have already made real cuts in this year's spending. We've offered reasonable compromise that seeks even more cuts, but more importantly, a compromise that seeks common ground, not capitulation, and neither should our colleagues expect capitulation. All we ask is that those on the other side do what's right and act in the broader interests of the nation, not shut down the government, disrupt services, put the economic recovery at risk, all to satisfy a narrow political agenda. Now, I know there was a lot of fanfare on the Republican budget proposal that was put out as we look to the next fiscal year. In my view, it is by far one of the most partisan, ideological, and fundamentally destructive budgets I have seen in my time in Congress. Destructive of fundamental protections for every American and for what we've come to accept as fundamental protections that are uniquely American. It fundamentally takes $1.5 trillion out of health care for seniors and children, and it gives it to the wealthy. It would take health care from seniors and children rather than take subsidies from special corporate interests like big oil companies. If Republicans got their way, New Jersey residents would lose $34 billion in health benefits, and almost 400,000 New Jerseyans would see their coverage cut entirely. The Republican proposal talks about cutting taxes, but in reading it, I find only two groups whose taxes would be cut: the rich and those who are even richer. Corporations and millionaires, or those soon to be millionaires, will keep all of their recent tax giveaways and would actually see their tax rate slashed by 30%. Now, this proposal loses $700 billion on the revenue side over the next 10 years by extending the Bush tax cuts, particularly to the wealthiest in the country, and trillions more by slashing tax rates for corporations and millionaires. Those making more than $1 million a year will see tax cuts of $125,000 each from the tax cuts, and tens of thousands of dollars more from proposed rate cuts, while people in my state would lose $34 billion in health benefits and 400,000 New Jerseyans end up without health coverage at all. This budget proposal shifts the balance to the wealthy, making cuts that do not reflect our values as a people and as a nation. And at the top of the list of draconian Republican cuts is Medicare. Let's for a moment look at the logic of the Republican budget proposal when it comes to Medicare, a program that since 1965 has protected seniors and made sure no older American would be without health care when they need it the most. In 1965, we passed Medicare. Why? Because senior citizens could not get health insurance. And the reason health insurance companies would not take the risk of insuring older Americans who logically would need to see doctors and receive treatment more often than younger Americans is rather clear. And even if there was such a plan, the cost would be prohibitive for a senior on a fixed income. So we created Medicare, and today it is one of our most successful programs, and no senior is left without access to life-saving, life-enhancing drugs or the care that they need. Now, what are the Republicans proposing in this budget? They're proposing to end Medicare as we know it. In fact, they want to privatize Medicare. And they say their privatization plan is just a way of asking wealthier seniors to pay more. But let's ask ourselves logically, how much do we think an insurance company will charge in premiums to a 65-year-old American male who may have had a heart attack or a heart ailment or suffers from diabetes? How outrageous do we suppose the premium will be? And how much of a voucher will that 65-year-old American need to purchase even a minimal health care plan? Mr. President, that logic escapes me. Today, buying a private plan on the open market for a self-employed middle-aged couple can cost as much as $18,000 a year. The average retiree in America is living on about $19,000 a year. So again, the logic escapes me. The fact is, this proposed privatization plan for Medicare completely overlooks the history of why we needed Medicare in the first place. It illogically assumes insurance companies will provide quality health care coverage at a huge discount to older Americans. Mr. President, if that isn't wishful thinking, I don't know what is. So let me close by simply saying it is time to make sure this government stays open. It is time to make sure we don't thrust the economy backwards, and it is time to ultimately ensure that those who have given service to this country, like the men and women in uniform, don't get hurt. And that we do by coming together on a reasonable budget. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that there be a period of morning business until 5 p.m. with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
I could not agree more that we should not have a government shutdown. I could not agree more that we need to take steps to protect and improve our economy. And I could not agree more that we need to take steps to make sure that our brave, uniformed men and women are fairly compensated and otherwise treated. I must, however, express my profound, albeit respectful, disagreement with my colleague, the junior senator from New Jersey. This is not a possible shutdown that we're facing as a result of the Republican Party or as a result of the Tea Party. As a lifelong Republican and as a founding member of the Senate Tea Party caucus, I can tell you unequivocally that there is not one member of this body, nor is there one member of the Senate Tea Party caucus who wants a government shutdown, certainly no Republican. Republicans have, from the outset of this, attempted to bring forward proposals to make sure that we don't get into a shutdown. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why does the President of the United States, President Barack Obama, want a government shutdown? Let's ask a few questions. Why was it that a few months ago, after the election, but before the new Congress took over, when the President had both houses of Congress under the control of his party, why did he opt not to pass a full budget for fiscal year 2011? That was the first seed that he sowed in the direction of a government shutdown. I submit that it was one that was either irresponsible on the one hand or deliberate and malicious on the other, intending to bring about a sequence of events that would culminate inevitably in a government shutdown. Number two, even after the new Congress convened, after the balance of power shifted completely in the House of Representatives and after a number of seats in this body shifted, the new Congress convened in January of this year, the President didn't bring forward something that could attract both houses of Congress to approve and that he could fund the government with for the balance of the year. He instead chose to operate on a series of continuing resolutions. We're now moving up against what I believe will be our 7th continuing resolution, if it's passed. What we have from the President is radio silence in the direction of what we need to do to move forward. A number of us have suggested all along in this process that at a point in time in America when we have a national debt approaching $15 trillion, at a point in time when we're adding to that debt at a staggering rate approaching $1.7 trillion a year, it doesn't make sense and it isn't responsible to continue, even in small increments, perpetuating that degree of reckless, perpetual deficit spending. And so what we want to see more than anything isn't any specific set of social issue legislation. It's not any specific degree of spending cuts. It is instead a plan, some plan, that will move us in the direction of a balanced budget, that will put us on track so that we might once again enjoy the benefits of a balanced budget, so that we might again enjoy the day and age when we don't have a debt-to-GDP ratio well in excess of 90%. Because we know that when we have a debt-to-GDP ratio in excess of 90%, which we do now, it slows economic growth in this country by as much as half every year, costing our economy as many as 1 million jobs every single year. This ultimately is about jobs, because our sprawling debt kills jobs and kills economic growth necessary to create jobs. So no, this is not a quixotic quest for perfection. This is simply a quest for that which will suffice to get us back on track for fiscal responsibility. Now, I mentioned 2 seeds that the President has planted to lead to a shutdown. The first being his refusal to push through a budget for the entire year of fiscal 2011. The second being his reliance on continuing resolutions. The third seed he sowed, one that I'm not sure we're going to be able to get around this time, much as we would like to, is his threat just in the last hour or two. His threat, his promise to veto the continuing resolution that the House is expected to be passing this afternoon and that it may have passed just moments ago. He's threatening to veto that before it even gets over here. One must wonder, why does the President want a shutdown? We have to remember, these are not drastic changes that have been proposed. In fact, they're not even sufficient, in my opinion, to get us back on track so that we can say this heads us in the direction of an eventual balanced budget. These are minor cuts, and yet the President insists on moving us inevitably, inexorably in the direction of a shutdown. Now, while we're on this subject of addressing a false blame that has been placed on the Republican Party and on the Tea Party, I care to address the accusation that has been made by various of my colleagues, an accusation that I believe was made in ignorance and in any event is manifestly incorrect with regard to the Tea Party. This is a movement whose views are not extreme. What is extreme is a $15 trillion debt that we're adding to at a staggering rate of $1.7 trillion a year. That is extreme, as is what has happened in the last few years, including the U.S. government takeover of everything from our banking industry to our auto manufacturing industry to our health care industry. Those things are extreme. The Tea Party movement is something that is shared by many Americans, regardless of whether they ever appear at a rally of any kind. It's a spontaneous, grassroots political phenomenon that simply recognizes that our federal government has grown too big and has become too expensive, and we need to do something about that. Many of us who consider ourselves part of the Tea Party movement believe that the best solution, perhaps the only solution to this, is to return to that 223-year-old founding document we call the U.S. Constitution. Look to those tasks, those powers that are identified as something within the exclusive ability, the exclusive power or control of the federal government. The more we do that, the more we believe we can turn to constitutionally limited government of the sort that can operate on a balanced budget. This is not necessarily even a politically conservative movement. It is neither conservative nor liberal. At the end of the day, it need not be either Republican nor Democratic. It is simply American. It recognizes that this country was founded, among other things, upon the principle that national governments, as they become large and powerful, have a certain tendency toward gaining an excess of power and spending an excess of money. And to prevent a form of tyranny, tyranny by any degree, a national government can function best when it has not broad plenary powers or police powers, as we put them, but limited enumerated powers of the sort that we granted the federal government a couple of centuries ago. Powers including things like national defense, establishing a uniform system of weights and measures, regulating trademarks, copyrights, and patents, and so forth. Included in that list, you won't find anything about a government takeover of health care or manufacturing industries or banking industries. This is neither liberal nor conservative. It's neither Republican nor Democratic. And it certainly isn't extreme. It is simply American. It's what makes us great. It's part of what has created the strongest economy and the greatest civilization the world has ever known. At the end of the day, as those who have planted quite deliberately the seeds for an inevitable shutdown seek to blame others, we have to remember the seeds that they have sown. And we have to be willing to cast blame where blame is due. The blame here cannot, and as long as I'm standing, will not be placed at the feet of the Republican Party or of the Tea Party. We do not want a shutdown, and we'll do everything we can to fight against it. If we have one, it will be because the President of the United States and members of the other party in this august body have refused to put forward a palatable, defensible budget. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to associate myself with my colleague from Utah. Appreciate the clarity of his remarks, and I'd like to add to them. And I'm glad we have some folks here today listening in. There's probably no other place in the country that you could hear so much nonsense than you're going to hear on the Senate floor today, and unfortunately just heard that from a colleague before, my colleague from Utah. The House just passed another resolution to fund the government, to fund the military for the rest of our year, pretty much at a figure we've all agreed on. It includes a funding just for 1 week to keep other aspects of the government open, and it makes some very modest cuts to our budget. Most of these have been agreed to in advance. But there seems to be one sticking point. This bill would prohibit funding using taxpayer money to fund abortions in D.C. My colleague who spoke just a minute ago said this is an invasion of reproductive rights. But I'm here to tell you that no one has a reproductive right to use somebody else's money for an abortion. And that's all this is about. Not only other taxpayers' money, but we're borrowing money to do something at a time when the country is nearly broke that Americans disagree on, and it violates the conscience of many Americans. But my colleagues on the other side have decided to make this the crucial issue. That either Republicans agree to use taxpayer money for abortions or they're going to shut down the government. And to say we're emphasizing social issues. This is not just a social issue, it's an American issue. Even people who support abortion support the idea that taxpayers should not be forced to pay for it. It's a small request. The cuts are small. But it is clear, as Senator from Utah just said, that this shutdown has been planned by the President and the Democrat majority for a long time, believing that they can win the PR battle, thinking that Americans are too stupid to figure it out. I'm confident as we go into this that Americans are much smarter than my Democrat colleagues agree. I think they're going to figure out how irresponsible the President has been, how much lack of leadership there's been here in the Senate. Trying to blame Speaker Boehner in the House, who controls one half of one branch of government, for a shutdown when last year, when the President controlled the whole government, we didn't pass a budget, we didn't fund any aspect of government, and this landed in the lap of the new Congress, which still includes a Democrat majority here in the Senate. There has not been one bill from the Senate that the Democrats agree on. The President has not sent down one funding request that we could vote for. We don't have a bill proposed by Senator Harry Reid today that we can vote for to keep the government open. But yet he's saying what the Republicans on the House side are sending over is not good enough. The House just passed another bill. 15 Democrats voted for it. If we had 15 Democrats here in the Senate who were reasonable, we wouldn't have to deal with this ridiculous, irresponsible government shutdown. I don't know what else Republicans in the House could do. They sent over 40 days ago, a bill that would have funded the government through the rest of the year with very, very nominal cuts. It was set up to fail here in the Senate. And we've yet to have hardly any debate on the issue. During all this time, we spent less than 3 hours of debate on the most important issue in the country. We spent the last couple of weeks on a small business bill. I bet no American could tell you what we're even talking about. And before that, we spent a couple of weeks on a patent bill. Anything we could do to avoid the responsibility of debating the most pressing issue in this country. And I also have to take issue with what the Democrats are trying to do here with the Tea Parties. And I'd like to remind them that many, many Tea Party members are Democrats, and they're independents, and they're Republicans, and many of them have never been involved with politics before. Many are Hispanic and African American, and they're all Americans, but they're concerned about our country. They seem to be able to do something we can't do here. They add and subtract, and they understand you can't keep spending more than you're bringing in and expect the country to survive. We even brought up a resolution here, the senator from Utah did, to have a sense of the Senate that we should balance our budget. Just about every Democrat voted against that. Do you know what that means? That means that there is an intent to bankrupt our country. Because there's no way around it. If you keep spending more than you're bringing in, you will bankrupt our country. That's the course this President has got us on. That's the course that Senator Reid and the Democrat majority here in the Senate want to keep us on. And when we try to do even modest, nominal reductions in spending, just to change the trend line, they are coached, as Senator Schumer has said, to call it extreme and to blame it on the Tea Parties. Americans are smarter than that, and I think my colleagues are getting ready to figure that out. So we come down to the bottom line that the senator from Utah just mentioned. Why are they doing this? They look back to 97, they're back in the 90s. They think that they can win the PR battle. And even more important, the President needs a distraction. The focus on the President now is revealing a lack of leadership in domestic policy and foreign policy. He's led us into a mess in Libya. He's led us into a domestic mess and has us on a course to bankrupt our country. He's trying to take over health care, and all those unions and other people who are advocating for it are now asking for waivers. There have been over 1,000 waivers to people who want to get out of this health care bill. This financial re-regulation, Dodd-Frank bill, is threatening to hurt our economy even more. The President needs a distraction. And this is a choreographed distraction to close the government down, to draw attention, to try to shift the blame from a President who's been AWOL from leadership and has very, very little political courage. And that's what we need right now across America. That's what Americans are asking us to do, is to keep fighting, be bold. This is not a matter of partisan politics as much as it is a matter of national survival. We have to make some hard decisions. We can't keep spending more than we're bringing in. We've got to do what families do, tighten our belts, balance our checkbooks. These are not radical ideas. All we have to respond to is what the House has passed today. The Senate, Democrats who control this place have not offered any solution. The President has not offered any solution. And I suspect that we will not even be allowed to vote on the one option we have, is what the House sends over here. Yet they think Americans are so stupid that they can come down to the floor and blame the Republicans, who really have no control of the situation except to send us what they think is best from the House. And that's what they're doing. And they need to be applauded. Speaker Boehner has done everything he can to try to work with all parties here to responsibly keep this government going. At the same time, to recognize we cannot keep this reckless spending the President has been doing the last couple of years. This is an urgent and serious matter that I'm afraid is being played as a PR game by the other side. The misrepresentations I heard just before about the budget being proposed on the House side are very difficult to swallow. The truth is very rare here in this body. I hope all Americans will take the time to look at what's really going on, because this is all a blame game, and the Democrats are counting on Americans not paying attention and to take their cues from the national media. We're going to do everything we can here to keep the government open, to responsibly respond to what the voters told us last November, and not to play the blame game with the other side. But this is being played as a game instead of a matter of serious issue. But the bill that will have a chance, hopefully at least to debate, that the House just passed, will take our number one responsibility to defend our country, to fund our troops, and to make sure that's done for the balance of the year. We can argue about the rest last week, but let's fund our troops this week and do what we were sent here to do. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll of the...
Mr. Cochran. Mr. Alexander. President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to add the names of the following senators to be co-sponsors of Senate Bill 724, Senator Manchin, Senator Udall of Colorado, and Senator Rockefeller.
Without objection.
Madam President, that brings to 43 the number of bipartisan senators, including the sitting chair, who are supporting the bill that will assure that our military personnel are paid even if there is a government shutdown. You know, we all realize the stresses that a military person and a family are under if that military person especially is deployed overseas. We have troops in Afghanistan. I was talking to my staff a minute ago, and he heard from one of his friends in Afghanistan on his 9th deployment who had heard about our bill, Madam President, and he thanked us for realizing that there might be a delay in the military pay and for trying to address it if, in fact, the government is shut down. 9th deployment, and he is worried about whether he is going to be paid on time so that his family with a 1-year-old child will be able to make sure and pay the mortgage on the first of the month. Oh, my gosh, what are we thinking here? Now, I think there are certainly legitimate disagreements about the spending and the budget. I am one who believes that we should be cutting the spending. I think the ways to get there are certainly legitimate areas of disagreement. There should be one thing, Madam President, on which we do not disagree, and that we would unanimously pass in this United States Senate, and that is that if, in the event, the government does shut down because the sides are still apart when the deadline comes Friday night, that our military get their paychecks, and those who are serving our military overseas or wherever with food service and the things that are done by civilian employees serving the military, they too would show up for work and they would be paid. We can't have somebody thinking, oh golly, now I wonder if I'm supposed to show up to serve the military meals in Afghanistan or in the base in Iraq or the police station where our troops are embedded. I mean, are we really going to ask those questions? I hope not. I hope that if there is one thing that this United States Congress and this President can agree on, it is there should be no question that the mother at home with the 1-year-old child whose husband is on his 9th deployment in Afghanistan will not worry that she will have that hopefully direct deposit so she can pay her mortgage on time. Now, Madam President, Senate Bill 724 just is very simple, very clear, that our military will be required to come to work, which will be no doubt for them, and they will be paid on time. The same goes for anybody serving the military, and it is essential for the service of the military. We have almost 100,000 people in Afghanistan today. We have 47,000 in Iraq. That is a lot of people who are serving under great stress and doing a great job under very trying circumstances. And I hope that this United States Senate, if in fact the government shuts down, can speak very clearly. Now, I don't think we can wait until 11 o'clock Friday night to make that determination. The process of getting the bills and the direct deposits and all of that is in right now because the paychecks are imminent. And it's about a week till the paychecks come, but you have a process, and we need to assure that that process is going forward. We know that the House, as we speak, is debating the one-week continuing resolution. It does have the funding for the Department of Defense until the end of the fiscal year. The President has said he will veto that over the riders that are in the bill, which means we could be facing that government shutdown. Madam President, I don't want the government to shut down because I think we don't even know the full consequences of that to the thousands of people who are affected, to the veterans who get benefits and live benefit to benefit, for the military personnel, of course, and those in the Department of Defense. I think many of us are trying to make the decisions who is essential in our offices. I think it is very hard to do the constituent services if you're in a government shutdown, and I can't tell you the number of emergencies that I get, people who have loved ones overseas, who can't get visas, can't get back, who've lost passports, and you just have so many calls that people need the services. So we have to select who are the essential services. These are all things that people are not aware of what will happen when there really is a shutdown of government. So I hope that we can come to the agreements, and if in fact we have an agreement that some people are saying we do for the top line spending, and I haven't heard it yet, so I don't know if that's the case, but if the leaders have made a decision that there is now an agreement on that, I would hope that we would be able to act and not have a government shutdown. I also hope that we will be able to pass a long-term continuing resolution. It is high time that people know what they can contract for, what government services are going to be ongoing, and at what price, at what funding level. Nobody would run a small business this way. Nobody would run a corporation this way. Well, we can't agree, so we will just have a week-to-week continuing resolution in a business. Nobody would do that. So I think that we have to be focused on the big picture. Yes, we've got 6 more months in this fiscal year until October 1. And we need to make sure that we get this out of the way so we can focus on what's going to really make a difference in whether we can get this deficit down and get the debt off the plate of our children in the future. And that is going to be the reforms that will be tied to the debt ceiling. If we don't have reforms, that's when we should draw the line in the sand and say we're not going to have the debt ceiling lifted without the reforms in place that will not allow us to hit that $14 trillion number in the future. I would hope that we would have a 10-year plan that would start lowering the deficits every year over 10 years so that eventually we would have it down to a reasonable amount as compared to our gross domestic product. That would give the credibility to the rest of the world that we're going to meet our obligations, that we would not default, and that we would be taking hold of our financial situation in this country. That would be the prudent thing to do, and I hope we will all be able to work together to do it. But as of now, I think the important thing for this Senate to do is to pass Senate Bill 724 that now has 43 co-sponsors, and it is a bipartisan bill that says the military should not have to worry about a government shutdown. That should be the last thing on their minds. They should be protecting themselves from harm in Iraq and Afghanistan, and their families should be able to do the best they can to support their families while their loved ones are overseas. And, Madam President, I hope that there will be a time going forward that we can pass this bill in short order, not at 11 o'clock Friday night, but in the next day or so, if in fact we are not able to see our way to passing the one-week continuing resolution that would prepare us, hopefully, for the long-term continuing resolution to get this fiscal year out of the way and let us focus on the next year's budget, which starts October 1st, and the long-term reform that is going to be necessary to start cutting our deficit significantly. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President,
The senator from Alabama,
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
Madam President, I understand our Democratic leader is meeting with a Republican Speaker of the House and the White House and working to try to establish the funding level that we will have for the rest of this fiscal year that ends September 30th. Let me explain briefly how we got here. Our Democratic majority in both House and the Senate failed to pass a spending level last year or to pass a single appropriations bill last year. And at the end of our session, voted a continuing resolution for 5 months. In the course of all of that, there was a national election, and one of the most driving force in that election was the American people's deep concern about reckless Washington spending and surging debt that they know is endangering the American economy, can reduce growth, cause a debt crisis, and put us on an unsustainable path, burden our children and grandchildren with massive debt, the likes of which we've not seen before. So the continuing resolution that passed late last year carried us 5 months of the 12 months fiscal year. And I suppose after the shellacking the big spenders took last fall, the biggest shellacking in 80 years, huge numbers of individuals got elected to the House and a large number in the Senate committed to containing spending. There should have been no doubt that when we came to decide how much spending we'd have the last 7 months of the fiscal year, that there would be proposals to reduce spending. And the House, I thought, responsibly came forward with a plan that they passed. And it called, H.R. 1, it calls for a reduction of spending by $61 billion and was sent to the Senate over the last 7 months of the fiscal year. And the Senate's done nothing. All we've said is we're not going to pass it. We have a vote on the bills. Actually, more votes were obtained in the Democratic-controlled Senate for the Republican House bill than votes achieved for the Senate Democrat bill. And 10 Democrats, senators, were uneasy with the bill the Senate majority produced because it only reduced spending $4.6 billion. I mean, had they forgotten what happened in November? Had they forgotten that projections continued to grow throughout the year, and instead of a $1.3 trillion expected deficit this year, the numbers have grown to $1.65 trillion, $1,650 billion in debt added to our country this fiscal year ending September 30th? And so did not the American people expect us to do something? Well, you would have thought that this $61 billion reduction is somehow the end of the world and everything better. So we've been fighting ever since. We've had a series of short-term continuing resolutions so the government does not shut down. Why should the government shut down? Because under our Constitution, if the United States Congress does not fund a government entity, the entity does not have a right to exist. It can't go out and operate as a government entity if it hadn't been funded by the United States Congress. So we've got a serious problem here, and there's a lot of tension, a lot of concern. I hope our colleagues and all reach an agreement. I hope that Senator Reid and Speaker Boehner can reach an agreement. But I'm uneasy about it. And frankly, I'm not happy about some of the things that have been occurring. Let me just show you what our Senator Reid, our Democratic leader, has been saying. You know, we want to have a compromise, they say. Why don't you guys all get together and be nice to one another? Well, we should, and we do, even though we sometimes are pretty aggressive on the in our debate. But it's a bit much when Senator Reid says the Tea Party is trying to push through its extreme agenda issues that have nothing to do with funding the government, as if this is a cause of the fundamental problem we have about how much money we're going to spend. Then he goes on to say, quote, they've made the decision to shut down the government because they want to make it harder, for example, for a woman to get a cancer screening. You know, I've asked my staff, what in the world, what could he be talking about there? And my staff thinks the only thing that could be referred to is a proposal to reduce funding for Planned Parenthood, the largest abortion provider in America. Then he goes on to say, do they really want to shut the government down because the Tea Party doesn't want scientists to make sure the air we breathe is clean and pure? Close quote. Give me a break. Goes on to say, this is the time we don't have to fight over the Tea Party's extreme social agenda. You know, they had a little tape of my good friend Senator Schumer, and he hadn't backed down from it, but they'd all agreed to use the word extreme. So they called everybody extreme. They had a press conference, and he got picked up, and they all called everybody extreme. But one of our fine Democratic colleagues' stomach wasn't quite strong enough for it. He talked about the extreme Republicans. Then he said, the extreme Republicans are my good friends. So good for him. But, you know, give me a break. Other statements like that, the Democratic leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi, says, quote, the GOP Ryan budget is a path to poverty for America's seniors and children and a road to riches for big oil, close quote. One of the congressmen over there said the Ryan budget puts yet another brick in the wall between the haves and the have-nots. Senator Conrad, my chairman of the Budget Committee, of which I'm the ranking member, calls that budget unsustainable and unreasonable. Well, we've got a problem in America. My debt in this country is dangerous. We're coming out of this recession. We need to continue growth. We need to continue job creation. It's not going really as good as a lot of people say, but it's improving a little bit. and it's way slower than most recessions for us to bounce back. But if we can just keep it going, fine. But Alan Greenspan, Erskine Bowles, Bill Gross at PIMCO Bond Company, the largest in the world, who has stopped buying U.S. Treasury bonds and sold all his U.S. Treasury bonds. Moody's evaluators have all warned us that we could be facing a crisis in short order, so we need to make some changes. Also, all of this is being conducted under an atmosphere that's affected by the budget for next fiscal year, the one that will be up and should be passed this spring and would cover October 1st next year for a year, the next fiscal year. And Chairman Ryan and his fabulous budget committee in the House have produced a very good budget. It's a courageous budget. It's a long-term budget. It deals with the unsustainable course that our Social Security and Medicare are on, and Medicaid. He proposes solutions that save those programs and protect our seniors, but yet put us on the right trajectory. It's a fabulous document. That's what they've been hammering here, is some sort of extreme document. But what has the Senate produced? Nothing. The Senate hasn't produced anything, nada. And this is most troubling. But what has the other party who's required to submit a budget? The Budget Act requires the Senate to produce a budget, it requires the House to produce a budget, and it requires the President to submit a budget. And the President, a week late, but did submit a budget. And I truly believe that in light of the dangerous conditions we're in today, the fact, as Mr. Erskine Bowles said, and Mr. Bowles, you will recall, is President Obama's choice to head the Debt Commission. Mr. Bowles tells us that, and Alan Simpson, that we're facing the most predictable economic crisis in our nation's history as a result of the debt we're running up. We cannot continue. This is unsustainable. Mr. Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, says you are on an unsustainable course. So what did the President do? What kind of budget did he propose? His budget increases spending every year. It increases discretionary spending every year. It increases taxes by $1.7 trillion. It doubles the debt in 5 years, triples it in 10 years, and is unsustainable. It is, in the light of the circumstances we face today, unacceptable. He provides no suggestion whatsoever to save Social Security, which is moving into an unsustainable course, nothing whatsoever to fix or strengthen Medicare or Medicaid, all of which every expert in the country agrees are on dangerous paths that cannot be sustained. It's stunning. Interest last year on our debt was $200 billion. We borrowed the money we don't have, and we borrowed. Interest last year was $200 billion. This year we're going to spend $3.8 trillion, and we're going to take in $2.2 trillion. Think about it. 40 cents out of every dollar that we're spending is borrowed. This is the third straight year with a $1 trillion-plus deficit. We're averaging about, these last 3 years, $1.4 trillion in deficits per year. The highest deficit we'd ever had before that was $450 billion. These are unsustainable. The lowest budget deficit projected by the President's own budget, scored by the Congressional Budget Office, the lowest annual deficit in 10 years would be $740 billion. Worse, it's going up in the outer years. The 10th year under President Obama's budget, the deficit would be $1.2 trillion. And the reason the numbers dropped were always there based on a projection that our economy will continue to rebound. Nothing that the President has done. His spending levels increased under the budget. So therefore, I believe, and I honestly think, that the President's budget, in light of the warnings and the danger that this debt is posing to America, is the most irresponsible budget ever presented by a President of the United States. It's stunningly damaging. It's unacceptable. It accelerates the unsustainable path we're on. As Congressman Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget, said, it makes it worse than the unsustainable baseline numbers we're operating under now. Makes it worse. And so we've got the Republican House has produced a good budget. The President has produced a budget that is unacceptable, and our Democratic colleagues in the Senate have produced nothing. They just want to complain. And anybody that sticks their heads up, they want to make these kind of attacks. Punishing working families, another brick in the wall between the haves and the have-nots. Deny women the right to have breast exams, cancer screening, extreme social agenda, extreme, 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 extreme. Be sure to use that word, extreme. I don't believe the American people are going to buy this. I don't believe that they're going to be taken in by the big spenders. They weren't last fall when 64 House members were elected, new ones, committed to restraining spending, and I don't believe they will in the future. But some think that, well, you know, that Republicans will get blamed for shutting down the government if they don't have an agreement. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. The House has sent over their bill to reduce spending by $61 billion. But as a matter of compromise, they've sent over another bill that would extend for another week and allow negotiations to continue for another week. They would reduce spending by additional $12 billion and would permanently fund the Defense Department through the end of this fiscal year. So they're not hung out there CR after CR, that the Defense Department, the people who defend our country, can have confidence in what their funding level will be the rest of the year. So it's over here. They've passed it. They've passed that legislation. So the Senate can pass a permanent fix for the rest of the fiscal year, or it can do one more week and we can continue to talk. But it's hard for me to imagine how the Republican House, which has sent two good pieces of legislation over here, ought to be blamed when the Senate has passed nothing. They brought up nothing. And it's a bit odd to me also now that the President said, well, I'm going to veto it. You know, he's been acting in the role. I saw one of the commentators this morning say the President wants to act like the good daddy and try to get the House together and the Senate together and put his arm around them and sort of be the person who brings them all together and so, well, maybe that'd be good if it'll happen. But it looks like he's taken that hat off and now threatening to veto even a one-week extension of spending that funds the Defense Department. Why? One experienced senator told me, he said, I'll tell you why, that Senator Reid may not have the votes. He may not want to vote on the one-week CR, but a lot of his members are getting tired of this. They know we've got to reduce spending. They know we need to fund the Defense Department. If it came up on the floor, maybe a lot of Democratic senators would vote for it, and it would pass. And we'd have another week, and maybe they can work out some of these agreements. I'm just saying all of this, you know, is sound and fury in politics, some people think. And I guess there is some politics in it. That's hard to deny. But this is not the normal political squabble between Republicans and Democrats. We really do face a debt crisis. We really have a responsibility, as President Obama's own debt commission told us, pleaded with us, to do something about the systemic threat that we face from surging debt that could knock down the growth that we're just beginning to feel a little bit here and make some progress. It could kick us back. And nothing could be more devastating to the country than if we had a debt crisis, as Alan Greenspan said, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, as Erskine Bowles said, the chairman of the Debt Commission, President Clinton's former chief of staff. These people are not unserious. They're warning us to do something and do it now, not just the short-term spending levels for the rest of this fiscal year, but the budget for the next year. And they tell us we've got to deal with the entitlements, the long-term dangers that they present, as well as the short-term spending levels. I believe Congress knows that. Some say the American people don't believe in cuts. They talk about cuts, but they don't believe in them. I don't think so. I believe Mr. Christie is hanging in there in New Jersey. Governor Cuomo in New York is proposing very serious reductions in spending. His popularity is strong. In Alabama, my home state, Dr. Bentley, our new governor, just announced that the discretionary spending levels would be cut by 15% the rest of this fiscal year. Nothing we're proposing is close to that kind of spending reductions in Alabama that they're talking about in Alabama. We're not close to that. But we're going to have to do some spending reductions, and it's going to be meaningful. It's going to be significant. It will be difficult to deal with, and we should do it in a careful way. But if we bring down this level of spending, it will have a transformative impact. For example, if you take the $61 billion and you did what the House said, reduce the spending level 61, that reduces the baseline of federal spending by 61, and over 10 years would save $860 billion, pushing $1 trillion. That's real money, just from reducing the baseline spending by 61. And we've got to think in terms of 10 and 20 and 30-year budgets, because as it gets in the outer years, the dangers are even worse. I believe we can do this. I believe the American people are ready to face up to these challenges. I salute my colleagues in the House for presenting a budget that's honest. If you want to know what kind of challenges we face, look at that House budget, because it deals with them. The budget that the President submitted is filled with gimmicks. When the Congressional Budget Office analyzed the President's budget, it found over $1 trillion in gimmicks. It found that his debt projections were off by over $1 trillion because of the gimmicks in the bill. I think Congressman Ryan's budget is honest. And not only that, it deals with the long-term threats to our economy and our finances. It's something we ought to consider. If my colleagues have different ways to achieve some of the things he achieved in his plan, let's hear them. Let's talk about them. Let's make sure that seniors aren't going to get hammered and unfairly treated in any way, and we can do that. We ought to have an open and fair debate, but the only people who stepped up and showed leadership so far has been the House Budget Committee. The President's budget is irresponsible, and the Senate has done nothing. It's time for us to get together, get our act together, finish the funding for this fiscal year, reducing spending every dollar that we can, and do a budget for next year that puts us on a path to a sound economy where growth can occur and jobs be created. I think the chairman would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.